there's 10 pounds of milk laying on the table on a per day basis, there must be something in there changing the gear ratio for these animals. Welcome back, everyone, to the Dairy Science Digest. This is a podcast designed to bring the Journal of Dairy Science straight to the ears of dairy producers. And I'm Reagan Blewell with the University of Missouri Dairy Team. And today's guest is Dr. Kenneth Kalscheur and his PhD student, Carlos Camisa Nova, from the United States Dairy Forage Research Center in Madison, Wisconsin. We're sitting right at the end of Q2, a time of the year when many producers are thinking about cash flowing side dress and fertilizer, analyzing all of the end of the quarter receipts. There's several listeners out there probably thinking about, how can I possibly reduce input costs? We know that the cost to rear our replacement heifer herd is the second largest enterprise on a dairy system. And feed represents well over half of the cost to rear those replacement heifers. And even though a lot of you have taken advantage of the beef on dairy thing and that's decreased your overall heifer inventory, there's always still room to reduce costs for those animals that are still remaining in your system. And honestly, listeners, some of my favorite research to feature are questions that come from the field, from the producers. And so this month, we're going to be talking about pasture-raised heifers and how that impacts not only their productivity, but also their cost of production when compared to confinement. These results are all in the featured article this month titled Growth and Lactation Performance from Dairy Heifers Raised in Confinement or on Pasture. So gentlemen, welcome to Dairy Science Digest. Thank you so much for joining us today. Would you please take a moment to introduce yourself to the audience?
Thank you, Reagan, for inviting us to be on this podcast. My name is Ken Kalscheur, dairy scientist at the U.S. Dairy Forage Research Center. Initially, I was at South Dakota State for 13 years as a professor, and then I moved here in 2014, where I focused primarily on projects affiliated with forage and fiber utilization.
How about you, Carlos?
My name is Carlos. I'm originally from Brazil. I started my PhD 2021 in a project that we are evaluating in long-term effects in dairy cattle when we raise the heifer in a different system. So yeah, it's going to be really nice to discuss about the data that we just published.
Yes, absolutely. And I feel like your replacement heifer enterprise is a great place to do a lot of grazing. Even if you are a confinement dairy, it's a good opportunity to reduce overall feed costs. So let's frame up the structure of the project a little bit. We've got 36 Holstein heifers that were born around December. And so then 4 months later, they were integrated into a management intensive rotational grazing system. But let's talk a little more about the setup of the grazing system and the frequency of movement when compared to a confinement reared heifer that's consuming TMR.
Yeah, I'd like to just start a little bit with a little background on this project, if you don't mind. And that is, this project was initially conceived by Dr. Jeff Brink, who is a research agronomist here at the U.S. Dairy Forage Research Center. If people get into the actual paper it published in the Journal of Dairy Science, they'll see that it was actually conducted, initially started in 2011 and completed in 2013. So I think it's important to state that at that time, there were people noticing that there were some benefits with raising heifers on pasture. So Jeff really is focused on the pasture. He's like, well, let's try this out with some dairy heifers at the Prairie du Sac farm, which is where our dairy farm is located. Mm-hmm. And he put together a really nice project with 3 paddocks of pasture and 3 pens in the barn. So we had the ability to do some statistical analysis. And so this experiment was done a number of years ago, and Jeff has since retired. So when Carlos came on board, we were really interested in pursuing additional research on raising heifers on pasture. So that was kind of the birth of Carlos's PhD project, and that's what we'll really focus on this particular paper.
Sure.
3 sets of animals, and when you look at, 36 animals isn't a lot, but it enables us to explore the idea of having a repeated sets of pens or paddocks on both scenarios so that we can actually conduct some statistics on this.
And guys, when we say management intensive rotational grazing, guys, this isn't super intensive, right? This rotation was a 2 to 4 day rotation on average. And so it's really kind of encapsulating opportunistic grazing is what I would like to call it, if that's okay. And the paddocks were made up of orchard grass and a brome mix. And, weather played a role in some of the data that was captured. And we'll talk more about that, I'm certain, because frankly, whenever you're grazing, you're subject to weather concerns, right? But I really applaud you and your former colleague for taking this data set that was captured. This was information that was valuable to dairy producers, and you're taking that data, you're analyzing it, and getting it into the hands of dairy producers, regardless of the fact that it's a decade difference. Because I think everything happens for a reason, and right now is a critical time in the dairy industry where there's several farm families that are at a crossroads trying to decide, okay, so we're going to expand our operation. We probably need to move some animals out. And what would it look like if we custom rear our heifers out on pasture with the neighbor? And so let's talk through some of the management associated with the actual monitoring of the pasture. How is the pasture forage measured and monitored during those growing seasons? Because there were 2 grazing seasons and 1 winter. So could you zoom in a little bit on some of the data captured for the pasture?
So yeah, really, what they did at that time was measuring with the plate meters, like how much biomass we had available, and always make sure we had biomass for the animals to graze. As you mentioned before, we had 2 years grazing for the heifers, and in the first year, the rain, it was like with a regular rainy season, it was okay to keep the animals out. The second year, we didn't have a regular rainy season. In that case, we need to supplement the animals. And I think for producers, it's pretty important because we have to follow the targets to have the heifers ready for the first calving, right? So in that case, we didn't have too much biomass available, even though we did the correct management and we were measuring the biomass and try to work with fertilizers and everything. But the grass was not growing because didn't have too much water. So in that case, we supplement the animals with a little bit of hay to keep the performance of the heifers. We have to keep watching the pastures pretty close to see if the animals can perform as we are expecting them to perform.
Yeah, good summary there. So the first year, there was more of a carbohydrate mix fed at 0.5% of body weight and encouraged that lean structural growth on the pasture system. But then the second year, because of lack of rainfall, you guys decided to supplement a hay or a forage-based supplement rather than any sort of carbohydrates. And that will be a point of interest as we go to discuss income over feed costs and what that might look like over a 2-year summary. But these calves, they were grazed during the grazing season, and then once the grazing season kind of shut down, then all animals were housed together in confinement, fed TMR, until the grass greened back up. So that was April, and then when did the grazing season end for you there in Wisconsin?
In this case, it was in the second half of October, and we started the second season in April. Yeah, mid-April for the second year.
And so depending on where you're listening from, everybody's weather and growing season is going to look a little bit different. Way up north where y'all are at, then that April to October period of time is 6 months of opportunity to reduce feed costs. So let's talk a little bit about what the feed looked like on the confinement side. When you guys were mixing TMR, can you talk about what the TMR was?
So in this trial, the TMR was corn silage, alfalfa, silage-based diet, and we had some concentrate feed stuff as well to formulate the diet. In the case of the trial, since it was a really long trial, depends what we had available, we were setting up the diets based on what we had available to feed the animals. But always targeting the animals to have about 1.8 pounds per day as the average day gain.
1.8. Very good. Yeah, with that average daily gain statement, let's talk a little bit about heifer growth. And of course, when the project was started, those heifers were stratified by weight. So there's no statistical difference at the beginning of the project when they were about 4 months of age. But then after one full grazing season, you did see a slight deviation in the body weight. Can you talk a little bit about that decrease in body weight?
Yeah, that's kind of something that we see in some trials and also in our current trial that we just finished. We also saw that difference. But what we have to remember that the animals outside, they have too much more activity. And that's something that we see, like, it impacts a lot in the end of the season. But in our perspective, it's not something that's going to impact because during the winter, the animals can back up and they can have a compensatory growth and they were able to perform as good as the animals in the barn. So yeah, that's something that we have to keep like watching pretty close because if you don't supplement the animals in the right way, if you don't check how the pasture quality is or the biomass available for the animals, you can have like a way, way lower average daily gain for the animals on pasture. So watching
Sure.
the performance of the animals out on pasture, and always like if you need to supplement, check the quality of the pasture and to check like how it's going to be better to formulate the supplementation for those animals.
Isn't this a bit like Goldilocks, right? We want to have it just right. We can't have inadequate amount of nutrition coming from the pasture, but we also don't want to have too much, right? For decades, we have known that if you feed an energy excess ration to these replacement heifers, she's just going to put that in her mammary. And the last thing any of these listeners want is a fatty udder, right? And so I bring up the fact that body weight might be decreased, and in this case it was about 6% decrease or 45-pound difference between the pasture raised animals versus the confinement raised animals, not to punch holes in the system, but just to acknowledge what maybe producers have seen in the past. Maybe you are seeing slightly leaner heifers coming off of pasture at the end of the grazing season, but just like Carlos said, that compensatory gain, once they come back into the barn, it'll be there. And I think the spoiler alert is, guys, that as they follow these animals out through first lactation, you're going to like the response of that. So let me see. We brought them in from pasture. We fed them a TMR that you just described being a corn silage alfalfa based diet there for the first winter. And then they went back out to grass as pregnant heifers. And that was the year that drought hit a little. So let's talk a little bit about that drought year, because Lord knows we can't control the weather, and that's part of a grazing system is to be flexible. And so the research team there in 2012 chose to take hay as a supplementation out to these research animals. Can you speak to the rationale or reasoning why the pasture-based animals received a forage supplementation rather than carbohydrate?
So I think one thing to note is like in the first year, there's an energy requirement that is often not met by pure pasture, which is why when you look at the diets, they have supplementation with concentrate. In year two, we're not looking for the same level of growth. So the NRC or the now NASEM, I think recommends, what is it, 1.69 pounds per day. And so the growth rate once an animal is post-pubertal and bred is a bit lower than pre-pubertal. So in this case, you can actually meet those requirements easier with a forage-based diet. And so we wanted to keep costs low. So an easy supplementation, we didn't want to dramatically change the diet. We still wanted it to be a forage-based diet. So the goal, I think, with the grass supplementation was to supplement a feed that was very similar to what they were consuming,
Sure.
which is the pasture. And so we didn't want to change the concentration of the energy because that would alter the experiment. So by adding the grass, we're feeding something very similar to what they were consuming. The only issue was they weren't consuming enough of it because of the drought. And so the goal was to create a similar diet to what they were consuming, but just so that they would meet their nutrient requirements with the grass.
Well, and I think it's commendable as we get into the feed costs and the income over feed costs. It's something to make note. A lot of the costs, it didn't take into consideration like manure handling, and so I don't think we should minimize the opportunity of keeping those animals out in the field where they can be depositing those nutrients with very little effort, very little human intervention. You're not required to scrape the lots every third day or anything like that. That can be very helpful. So let's zoom in on the actual feed costs a little bit and looking at the pasture. Can you talk through how did you determine what cost to place on per pound or as published per kilogram of dry matter produced by the pasture?
So yeah, really, that's a really important question. In this paper, the analysis was just done based on the feed cost, not actually like the total cost for the like related to the heifers. And what we count for the pasture, we counted the fertilizer cost that we had we spread some fertilizer in the field. We also counted for minerals that we used for the heifers, the cost related to the establishment of the pastures. So, and as long as it was like in a long term, we divided by the number of the years that we used the pasture. That's how we calculated that. It was not like really in depth in the calculation for like total cost, like including like fixed costs, like land costs, for example. But the idea was like with the information that we had, how much would it cost to have the animals on pasture in the confinement? And also in the confinement, we just calculated based on the cost of individual ingredients that we have in the diet.
And then just calculated on based off of diet composition. And so, in summary, as you were looking at it, your first year, your pasture ranged about 27% lower than your confinement fed heifers, and then the second year, with the lack of need for those expensive carbohydrate inputs, you actually had a pasture rate at 42% lower in cost than that of the confined animal. Now, so that's interesting to bring up that, I mean, the concept of being able to decrease your total feed cost by 35% on average over the 2-year window is just pretty profound to me. I'm excited about your data set and hopefully getting it in the hands of dairymen so that they can make the best management decisions. Now, once the animals were developed on pasture the first grazing season, then they came in, and while they were in for the first winter, they were bred. Can you talk to me a little bit about the repro effect of pasture versus confinement?
Actually, like, the animals didn't have any difference for breeding. We just watched the body weight and the correct BCS for the animals to get bred. And since it was a study, how we set up that was like based on the body weight age and that the animals were reaching to create the groups to breed the animals. Because like our goal was not to have like animals like having too old, that would impact the lactation performance data that we collected, and also like avoiding like really young heifers getting bred. Basically the management will use protocols that was like able to synchronize the groups to get bred.
I'll just add that when they were brought in for the season, the winter season, they were all treated identically. They stayed in their groups, but then the management was identical for both the pasture and confinement through the winter season.
Yes, and so ultimately, as a result, there was no reproductive effect. So regardless of the fact that they were slightly different body weight, they all bred and they all calved in within that 24-month window, which is very desirable. And so just want to make sure that knowledge that, wow, they can still have a reduced total feed cost and be reproductively successful. They're going to calve in at that 24-month mark. Let's kind of go into the milk data, and this is where I get a little bit excited. Talk to me about the first lactation performance over time.
So yeah, we collected the data, the lactation data based on 5 days of milk production data, and we calculate the average. And for the dry matter intake also we did it the same way. And what we saw for milk production, the animals that came from pasture, they were consistently producing more milk throughout the forced lactation.
That's awesome.
That was something really exciting for us, and it's because like we didn't collect too much information to explain why those heifers were producing more milk, and now it's something that we are still investigating and getting more information from the cows for the current trial if we're going to see the same effects.
Sure. And
What we saw was like animals from pasture, they were producing more than the animals that was raised on confinement. We didn't see anything different for body weight and milk composition, but one thing that we saw it was different was the dry matter intake. The animals that came from pasture, they were able to eat more. They have a greater capacity for eating. So we believe like the answer was pretty straightforward. The animals were eating more and they were producing more, but we still need to investigate why those animals were able to eat more, and if it's something related to the metabolism or development that could impact that.
sure, it's super fascinating. Let's assign some numbers to this, guys. So you took 4 different time points and looked at performance both on dry matter intake and total milk yield, and over time, from day 50 all the way to 200 days in milk, that primiparis or first lactation animal that had been housed just for 6 months 1 year and 6 months for the next year, it resulted in 9.7 pounds of daily milk production increase. That's a profound number. And I think it's important to highlight the fact that you were indicating that dry matter intake has to have something to do with this, right? As you saw an increase of around about 2.5 to 3 pounds of more dry matter intake going into these animals, it is quite curious what's going on. And I really enjoyed the discussion that you had there in the paper. And of course, there'll be a clickable link at the bottom of the show notes if guys want to scroll through and inform themselves on this article. But that dry matter intake always translates to milk. Anytime you can get another pound of intake into your milk herd, you'll see it in the tank. And I think your data set informs us of that. And over the entire lactation, when you multiply it all out, it was just over 2,700 pounds of milk more for the animals housed on pasture above those that were fed confinement the entire time. And there was a blip of increased protein, about 175 pounds more over the entire lactation, with no significant difference on fat. And, kind of talking a little bit about maybe increased rumen capacity, but did you want to talk anything about hepatic metabolism?
So yeah, and to discuss about that, we have to talk a little bit more about what we are doing now, for the current trial, because we are getting more information from the heifers and then during the first lactation as well. And what we have seen looks like there are some adaptation in the transition period already. So animals, they look like they are still eating, they can eat more in the transition period as well. That's some data that we have published in some abstracts, and soon we're going to have that as a paper as well. And the idea was maybe the animals, the metabolism is not like so challenge. The challenges for the metabolism is not that really intense in the transition period, and the animals, they can get like a healthier at the first calving, and after calving the challenges for the animals with metabolic disorders is lower. So that's something interesting that we have seen now, and I think like we're going to have really interesting discussion about that as well. But in this first trial, we didn't have too much information, like I said, for them. We just had the performance data. And I think like with the current trial, we are going to have way more explanations and more evidences to show why those animals, they could have like a healthy or better metabolism for the first lactation.
Oh, I'm really excited about that paper coming out, and I'll definitely be watching the journal.
This is the study that really jump-started Carlos's PhD program. And, this was a phenomenal study done by somebody interested in pasture and impact on animals, but it wasn't really an in-depth animal study, to be fair.
Right.
It was really, hey, what happens when we raise animals on pasture? As now that we really started thinking about it, it's like, what is the explanation behind this?
How could this be?
Yeah.
Yes.
So three, I mean, like you said, 2700 pounds is a lot of milk.
It is.
It's like, whoa, like, why is this happening? So, Carlos alluded to this. We took information from this study, and now it's out there in this paper, and developed another feeding trial from this work, which is really the bulk of Carlos's PhD program. And that is something he's working to finish up on this summer. So he did allude to some things that he's finding out from the new study that could help explain results from this study. And part of that is when we developed the second study, we really wanted to get at, what could be the explanation behind some of these results. And it's not as simple as, growth rates, and there's a lot of other things that play a role, like,
Sure.
I like to think of the animals on pasture as athletes, and the others in the barn as couch
potatoes. Yes.
In reality, there's a big activity difference between the and when you think about activity and what their nutrient requirements will be because of that activity, in addition to their capacity to actually consume feed, two groups are really quite different, which really makes this a management style paper in contrast to, say, a nutrition study.
For sure. Yeah.
The two styles of rearing animals are quite different. And so there's a lot of things that go into play on looking at, hormonal or metabolite differences, behavior differences, rumen microbiome differences, and what impact that has on intake, on rumen development, on gas emissions, the productivity, and future lactation. So, it's really a fascinating project.
You bet.
And it's something that I think people have observed in the field, but there really hasn't been great research because these studies are difficult to do.
Oh, it's so hard. It's so hard to capture it because as research scientists, we really want to control everything. And there's nothing about grazing that any human man can control, right? And so it's a challenge to research grazing systems. And I applaud you guys to take this foundational data set and expand upon it. And I can't wait to read that upcoming project because, if we pause and think about it biologically, we rarely think about primiparous animals having issues with transition, right? And not to say that quote unquote issue, but golly, if there's 10 pounds of milk laying on the table on a per day basis, there must be something in there changing the gear ratio for these animals. So really cool, very interesting, and just touching the surface of how amazing and intricately made this beast is. So one of my favorite questions to ask everybody, and you can take this whatever direction you want to go, but if you were to speak directly to the dairy producers and summarize this article, what's the one thing that you'd really like boots on the ground dairymen to take away from this informative project?
So for me, I would say watch our heifers because in a long term, it's going to show up something for you. How we raise our heifers and watching body weight gain and watching the age at first calving, it's really important, but looks like we have way more behind going on. That's going to impact a lot the performance after calving of the heifer. So I think it's really interesting how we have to see the best way to raise our heifers because it's going to have a payoff after calving as well.
Kim, would you like to expand on that?
Sure. When I think about your question, I think about this as a potential win-win situation where we win on the heifer growing side, lower cost. Heifers can still achieve the size we need them to be. And when they get into the herd, it's another win.
Right.
Because
She produces more.
the capacity of the animal to consume feed and produce milk is there.
Yeah.
I think my take home would be that, yeah, I will recognize that not every producer has the ability to raise heifers on pasture. And, it depends maybe where you are geographically in the U.S., but there are a lot of places. There are marginal lands available that producers have that could be utilized for heifer growing operations and lead to positive results later on once those cows join a lactating herd.
You bet. Absolutely. And thinking outside of the box is never a bad thing, guys. Perhaps they could hire in a heifer integrator that would be willing to do these daily actions, these daily movements, and be a young stock manager on grass and explore the opportunity of reducing overall costs and expanding production. Like you were saying, a win-win. Well, guys, this has been a great discussion, and I thank you so much for your time and willingness to share these findings about grass-based heifer development. This is coming all at a time when producers are really sharpening their pencils on cost of production, and I know this discussion has helped plant some seeds around the idea of how can I reduce some input costs while actually improving production. And listeners, maybe I don't tell you enough that I really do applaud you for taking time out of your day to listen in and advance your operation forward by gaining access to sound science to base your management decisions around. I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's been the June edition of the Dairy Science Digest, which is a monthly podcast project designed to bring the Journal of Dairy Science straight to your ears. It's provided to you by your University of Missouri Dairy team, so please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to get future editions straight to your cell phone. This is Reagan Blewell with the Dairy Science Digest, and I hope you have a fabulous June Dairy Month.